Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar brought to you by Headfirst. So we're excited to talk to you a little bit about the recruiting space, specifically what your players should be doing and some of the things to avoid, especially when it comes to the higher academic recruiting space. For anyone who's joining us live, know that this is being recorded. And if you need to leave at any point, no worries. We're happy to send this along via recording. So with that being said, let's get started and run through tonight's agenda. So starting off, we'll quickly run through who exactly is talking through you at the screen tonight, and then we're going to go over four main topics. So we'll cover coach communication, so also how to make sure your players are getting the exposure that they need, navigating the various showcase and tournaments, how to really maximize your players' experience at them, and then we'll just do some general recruiting tips that are relevant in today's landscape. And then at the end, we'll open it up to Q&A. With the live audience as well, some questions that we've also received recently. So with the agenda out of the way, Max, happy to introduce you.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So my name is Max McKenna. I'm a senior manager here at Headfirst, specifically working with the Showcase Camps division. Once upon a time, I played my college baseball at Amherst College, graduated there in 2011, had interned for Headfirst for 2 summers while I was in college, then went into teaching and coaching for a few years in the Northeast, first at Phillips Andover Academy north of Boston, and then as a head baseball coach and history instructor at the Master's School outside New York City, and came back to Headfirst full-time in 2014, and really since then have worked very closely with this division, with coaches like you all and with players like the ones that are on your teams to really help optimize their recruiting process and deliver some good content, some good guidance, some good advice, and some great events to help them advance their recruiting.
Great. Thank you, Max. So me, right? My name is Michael Rothstein. I work on the business development and partnership side here at Headfirst. I just graduated with my master's from NYU in sports business. Before that, I earned my bachelor's degree in history and social science from Florida Southern College, where I also played baseball and was fortunate enough to be named to the SSC All-Academic team 3 years in a row there, as well as the Dean List. I've been with Headfirst for several years now, and a big part of my role is helping student athletes and their families better understand how to navigate the higher academic recruiting process and how to get the most experience out of camp with us. So moving to our first topic of the night, we have coach communication. So let's start off with some of the do's. So first and foremost, personalize everything. So every email, every text, every DM, make sure it's tailored, right? Coaches can tell right away if they're getting a generic message that's kind of been copied and pasted to 50 different schools, right? So we always say to mention something specific about their program, whether it's a recent game, a player you admire, or why their academic fit works for you. Especially after a showcase, bring up a conversation that you had or something that they said to you that resonated. Let them know why you're reaching out to them. The next point is to go beyond just the email, right? Email is just one part of the equation, to build in other touch points that help coaches remember you. So be active and professional, especially on platforms like Twitter and X. Coaches do check their social media. So don't be afraid to send a thoughtful DM, handwritten letters. I haven't personally used one of these, but, they certainly still can definitely go a long way. And of course, when appropriate, phone calls and text. A quick check-in and a thank you after a showcase or just a simple update, I think can really make a big impression. So the really key point here is, for your players, be human, be real, but also show that you're serious. Following up, this is huge. Make it a habit to follow up when there's something meaningful to share. Like I said, a new test score, updated summer schedule. I think that's really important that your target schools know where you're playing throughout the summer. A recent highlight video, a new transcript, academic award. You're mainly using these as chances to keep your name in front of coaches without overloading their inbox. And then also something that I noticed is that always respond to existing threads with coaches. So this is something I learned this past summer when talking with our Columbia coach on the baseball side, believe it or not, is that so many times players restart threads instead of using existing ones. And the real takeaway is that if a coach does finally see one of your players' emails, and they're able to scroll down and be like, oh, wow, this player has emailed me 5 times and all these good videos instead of looking at the first email. So that's important. And finally, always proofread everything. This one might certainly sound small. I think it matters though the most. Typos, grammatical errors, spelling a coach's name wrong. Those are the kind of things that can like instantly hurt your credibility before hitting send. So read them out loud, double check your names, make sure your message is clear, clean, and polished.
Yeah.
Moving. Oh, go ahead, Max.
Well, yeah, and one thing that kind of I think ties the first and the last bullet point here is when you personalize, as Mike said, you want to make sure that you're blending kind of a curiosity with your research. So know something about the school, things that are readily available about a school on the internet, your players should know, and they can use those to personalize that outreach. If you're emailing Babson, for example, yeah, mention, hey, I'm interested in Babson because of the undergrad entrepreneurship program. I think that that's really cool. It lines up with my interests. That's what I'm kind of thinking about. Now, that also then does ladder into proofreading, right? You wouldn't believe how many stories we get from coaches who say, I get emails every day that are addressed to a different coach, a coach at my rival school. I'm the coach at Williams, and they say, hey, coach, I'm really excited about Amherst, right? Like those sorts of things happen all the time. So the more you personalize, the more it's going to resonate with the coach, but also you need to make sure that you're proofreading not only for did I spell things right, is my Grammarly not highlighting anything in the email, but also is it the right coach? Is it the right name of the school? Is it the right email address? Is it the right mascot? Is it the right major that I'm focusing as I personalize this? Don't send an email to a liberal arts school that says I'm really excited about your engineering program, right? Because they might not have one. So you want to make sure that everything you personalize, you're also proofreading in the sense that it corresponds to the school that you're sending it to.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think this like really segues really well into like the first don't, which is like don't mass email, right? Or use email merges or BCCs, right? This is like a huge one. Coaches can tell when they're one of 50 people getting the same message. I mean, they've seen so many, probably a million different variations of a coach email. Make sure your email starts with dear coach, but then doesn't mention anything specific about their school like you just talked about. I think that's where you get a lot of emails that go straight to the trash or they're just being overlooked. So, if your players are using a tool or a template to send emails more efficiently, which nothing against that, just make sure it is personalized. Otherwise, you start to lose that trust before you've even started the conversation. And then another one, Max, I'll flip it over to you, is just don't pester email. I think, like you said, there's a fine line between being persistent and being annoying. And I think that's something you can explain really well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, so you want to make sure that your players are following up with coaches and they're not, and it goes down to this next one, don't give up, right? Like just because you send one email that doesn't get a response, that's not a reason to never email that coach again and say, well, they read it, they don't like me, I guess I'll stop emailing them, right? So you do need to be persistent. You need to send follow-up emails. You need to have a reason to update them and say, hey, coach, I just, got a new transcript or whatever it is. But you also don't want to be emailing them without a specific purpose or without an intent, because that's when it starts to come across as pestering. The example that I always use is you don't want to necessarily say, all right, I'm going to email Coach Jody Gabriel today because I said that I was going to email McAllister every Tuesday morning. And it's Tuesday morning, therefore I'm going to email her whether I have anything of value to say or not. And so it is about finding that balance. And the tricky part is that there isn't kind of one heuristic or one rule that works for everybody where it's like, yeah, don't email more often than X, but email at exactly Y cadence, right? Unfortunately, that's not how it works. So it's tough to kind of build some of these rules. But generally speaking, a few things that I would touch on are one, have a reason that you're emailing, right? If you have updated video, you have an updated transcript, you have a change to your summer travel schedule, you have new test scores, these are all really good reasons to email a coach and say, hey, coach, I have a really important update. I just got my latest round of SAT scores and wanted to make sure that you have them. They're higher than the last one, so I wanted to make sure I put them in your inbox. Great reason to email someone. So I think that if you have some of those, like an organic update or reason to be emailing, that certainly helps. And it's going to get more frequent. Your email cadence with coaches will get more frequent as you work through the process. So 2026s might be emailing around once every 3 weeks, whereas 2027s, you don't need to email that frequently right now because a coach cannot personally reply to your email right now until September 1st, right? So it is different as you work through the kind of time cycle, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. You're going to be start to email more frequently. And also as you get interest, you're going to be emailing more frequently. If you have a serious interest from a coach and they're really interested in recruiting you, then you're going to have more leeway. They're going to want more frequent updates from you than if they haven't replied to your emails before. So finding that balance is tough, and it kind of goes coach by coach, but those are a few kind of general rules that that we work from. Now, also, as I mentioned, don't give up. Radio silence does not mean that it's over and that it's not going anywhere. And especially with some of the rules with like the September 1st contact date and some of the other things that a lot of these programs are working with, there's different times for different grad years and for different players in the process. So radio silence does not mean that your recruiting is dead in the water with that school. It might mean that you need to follow up. It might mean that you need a reason to follow up, but it doesn't mean that you should give up because every coach is different with how they treat their inbox. There's program by program differences. There's NCAA rules guiding what Division I coaches are allowed to do. So don't give up. And then finally, and this is one that I feel very strongly about, is don't ignore or blow off any coaches who email you. And this is something that I would recommend for coaches to tell your players, because I think that to some degree, a lot of high school players don't necessarily know how ignoring or blowing off or a rude response to a coach can reflect on them, and also how small the world of college softball can get, right? The main reason to not blow off or ignore any coaches who email you is, as a player, you don't necessarily know how your recruiting process is going to evolve and change. So a school that currently isn't on your radar, as you learn more about it and as you learn more about where you fit into the college softball ecosystem, might become the perfect option. And so you don't want to close any of those doors before you know. And it's a really small world where the coach at McAllister might be best friends with the coach at Harvard. And so if Harvard's your dream school and you say something out of hand to the McAllister coach, that might get to them, and they'll say, you know what, that player didn't handle this communication super effectively. I don't know. And it can start to kind of tarnish your reputation within the network of college coaches. So always reply. It doesn't mean you have to say, yes, coach, I'm super interested in your school to every school that emails, but it means hey, coach, thank you so much for your email. Right now, blah school is not on my list. I'd love to learn more and maybe, take a look at the website and see any information you have. Thank you for reaching out. You can be polite. You don't have to say yes to everything, but it is about being polite and kind of being candid, and handling that communication with integrity as well.
Yeah, Max, to like bounce off you, I do love the point that you said about not ignoring coaches or blowing them off. In my experience, I always say treat, every relationship like it's the most important relationship you have. There's that quote, I think it's like treat superstars like regular people and regular people like superstars. I always like to say in this case, like every coach is a superstar, but you should also treat them like a superstar because you honestly never know, right? And like all the time, and like myself included, people have that D1 fixation and then put the D3 or a D2 program on the back burner, which, there's nothing wrong with having those types of goals, but like you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket, because if it doesn't work out, like you said, you might not have anything to fall back on, and you don't want those coaches. You never want a coach feeling like they're an afterthought or a second thought. So moving on to our next topic. This one kind of builds on a few points we've already mentioned just before, but this is getting the exposure that players really need. So if you take one thing from this part of the webinar, let it be that exposure doesn't just happen. You have to plan for it, right? Not every event is created equal, and not every school recruits from the same showcases, camps, or tournaments, right? So that's why it's so important for players to seek out opportunities that give you direct, guaranteed access to the schools that you're targeting, right? So that if there's a program, you're serious about, you need to be where they're going to be. So that might mean attending a showcase that guarantees access to those coaches, right? Choosing tournaments where specific schools aren't committed, or attending a prospect camp that aligns with your academic goals. What I tend to see a lot of times is that players go to the big flashy camps with huge names in college softball. And I will not discount that experience because it certainly is first class, right? But often when I talk to those parents, they think that's helping them get recruited, right? Is it beneficial to play in front of college coaches and get feedback? Absolutely. But if a player is looking at a higher academic school and is only going to events with Alabama, Oklahoma, and SEC schools, that's not really benefiting their overall recruiting goal, right? The other part is that everyone's plan looks completely different, right? There isn't a one size fits all process, right? We all wish there was like a perfect golden path for college recruitment, but that's not reality. You know, what works for one player might not work for the next, and that's totally okay. But the key here is to have a plan, right? It's for players to sit down, map out your schools, and work backward, right? Like, where do they recruit? What events do they attend? How can I get on their radar before that event happens, right? This process can 100% feel overwhelming, but when you start making intentional choices and where you show up, how you engage, you know, you shift from hoping to be seen to making sure that you are seen. Moving on to the don'ts, let's talk about the mindset here because how you approach this process can honestly make all the difference. The first biggest one is don't be passive. Your players take control of your process, right? If you're waiting around hoping something happens, in a way you're already behind, right? There are no shortcuts. There's no secret formulas, which I said before, you know, unless you're hitting balls into the trees, right? There, but there's something that that is close to it, and that's being proactive, right? So the players who we see find success, especially with higher academic schools, are the ones who are intentional, they're organized, and they're aggressive, but in a very respectful way about their process, right? This means to take ownership, to set goals, to make sure you're sending those emails, make those phone calls, build your plan, and then also execute it. You know, you can't assume that coaches will just find you. I think this is one of the biggest myths in recruiting that, like, if you're good enough, coaches will just magically show up. The truth is, like, even great players get missed, and we sadly see it honestly every year. Or a college coach who's like, damn, like, where has that kid been, right? Especially at higher academic schools, you know, where recruiting budgets are a little bit tighter, exposure is more targeted. You know, you can't just afford to hope to be seen, right? You have to put yourself out there in the right places at the right times in front of the right coaches. And the other thing is to just not rely on just big tournaments and travel ball alone. That's certainly getting you out there. That's getting you the reps. That's getting you some exposure. Those events, you know, have incredible value, but they're not built to guarantee exposure, especially for higher academics, like we said, that don't have those typical budgets for some other programs. So if you want to be on those lists, you kind of have to meet them a little bit halfway. So that means, once again, like targeted showcases, targeted tournaments, direct communication, and personalized outreach, right? It's about taking control, and it's about players advocating for themselves and remembering that recruiting isn't just something that happens to you, it's something that you have to go out and make happen. Max, anything to jump in here on?
Really well put. I think two things that I would kind of double down on there. One is mixing up formats helps coaches get a more complete sense of players, right? So, yes, they want to see you at a tournament playing for your travel team where the outcome matters and your players are bought in with their teammates and they're kicking butt there. Like, that's a super important context that coaches care about recruiting. But obviously, the emphasis at many of these tournaments isn't necessarily on the individual player and spotlighting the individual player, which is where something like a head first comes into play. So the idea is a coach gets to see you in some of these competitive tournaments playing in a team setting where the outcome of the game matters. And they also get to see you in a different format, a different context, where the emphasis is on spotlighting the individual player, and the coaches have an opportunity to directly interact with players to get to know them a little bit better as well. So that kind of mixing of formats, intentionally seeking out some of these different formats, we've seen deliver huge benefits to players, like not just doing showcases, not just doing tournaments, but really intentionally finding a blend between them, I think is so, so important. The other thing is and Mike, you put this really well, but don't assume that coaches are going to find you. That is, I think, the number one myth. And just to illustrate it with an example, the number 3 overall draft pick in last year's MLB draft, Charlie Condon, he was a head first alumni. and he came to Head First in 2020, and he had a couple D3 offers. Didn't take them. He was he led the nation in home runs as a junior in college, playing at a Georgia. Like, he was a number 2 overall draft pick, and he did not have Division I offers. Now, part of that is he matured as a player, and obviously a great credit to him and getting bigger, faster, stronger, and working on his game. But also, he got missed, right? These coaches don't necessarily, just because you are good doesn't necessarily mean they're going to find you, especially at some of these larger tournaments. The other thing that I would say is, even for the player who is hitting balls into the trees and absolutely hitting tanks every time they're at the plate, I still want that player to be proactive, because I don't want players to be found in the recruiting process in the passive voice. I want them to find themselves through the recruiting process. How are they being proactive to not just say, like, oh, I hope somebody finds me and I get to play at their program, but what is the school experience? What's the college experience that is right for me? And how do I proactively put myself in a position to recruit myself to that program, right? I want to eliminate the passive voice from the recruiting process as a whole, because I don't think that it benefits the player. Players need to put themselves in the driver's seat and seek out the right holistic overall college fit. And being found, being seen is not the way that sets players up to be able to do that. So that's my soapbox, is kind of removing the passive voice. And to do that, you need to be proactive and seek out these opportunities.
I love it. Very well put, Max. Moving on to a topic that we were kind of just talking about, right? One of my favorite topics, which, like I said, we just covered, is really navigating. Is once your players are at these sort of showcases and tournaments, is how to navigate them and how to really impact your players' recruitment. So for the dues, we kind of already covered the first 2 bullets, right? Targeted, guaranteed exposure. That really is the number 1 priority. Now, once you're there, right, your players, you need to prepare them for this type of engagement, right? This is more than just skill. It's about presence, right? It's about helping your players be ready to connect with the college coaches. We always tell our players to do the following when you're talking with a coach. And these are just, a handful. It's like, give a nice firm handshake with coaches, introduce yourself, ask questions, make eye contact. Always make sure you take off those sunglasses. Yep, exactly. That's a huge one. These are the interactions that stick with coaches, right? And they separate a player from the pack. With that is confidence. Confidence comes from this sort of preparation. So you walk into the event ready for your players to show off who they are on the field, but then also who they are off the field. And then most importantly, which Max, you can explain really well, is playing your game.
Yeah, so I think that one thing that we see is, there is no denying that a showcase with 40 or 50 college coaches watching, many of them be at schools that you would love to go play at, that's a high pressure environment, right? That is different than playing on a field when you were 11 just for the love of the game, right? It is a different, more pressurized environment. What we see, or what we sometimes see, what we try to talk to players a lot about at camp, is don't let that impact the way that you play your game. If you're a contact hitter who hits line drives all over the field, the first day of a showcase or the first day of a big tournament is not the day that you're going to go 7 for 6 with 8 home runs. That's not going to set you up for success, right? Play your game and trust the hard work that brought you to this point. It's going to put you in a better position to succeed when the lights are on. And B, that's going to truly represent who you are as a player to coaches. And coaches ultimately are recruiting the player that you are and the player that you're becoming. So you really need to trust the hard work that has put you there, right? What I always say to players when they're at camp is, you've already done the hard work. Like, these 2 days at a Head First event, this is the easy part. This is the fun part. This is where you just get to go and ball out. The extra deadlifts, the wind sprints, the extra BP, all that stuff, all the extra reps that you took, that's the hard part. This is the easy part, where you get to trust that work that you've put in and let that speak for you. To do that, you need to make sure that players are playing their game. They're not trying to be someone that they're not, be a different type of player because they think that that's what coaches want to see. So, laddering straight to the don'ts, obviously what you don't want to do, what players don't want to do, is try to play someone else's game, or try to be something you say, all right, everyone's putting a lot of attention on this player who's hitting monster shots in NCAA softball right now. I'm going to try to do that, right? Don't try to play someone else's game just because you think it's what coaches want to see, because that's not going to set you up for success.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. One of the biggest bullets that I do see under the don'ts that I really want to highlight is after a showcase, the role in which players or coaches can play, right? So after a showcase and tournament, I think it's super easy to move on to the next event, even players, right? To the next trip, to the next game. And like I said, I totally get it. But those 24 to 48 to 72 hours after event, I think that's prime time for players to really capitalize on interest. And then a lot of times I see that they often need a nudge. I mean, we always see that they need a nudge at our event as well. So I'm not saying it's a coach's job to babysit your players, right? But as coaches, I know you've got enough on your plate from managing rosters, logistics, keeping the energy up. But I think what is valuable here is, and what makes a big difference is taking, 2 minutes at the end of an event or a showcase or a tournament and reminding your players, hey, make sure you follow up with the schools that you spoke with today or that you played in front of today. Send a thank you email, update your recruiting profile with any sort of new videos and metrics, because I think otherwise you miss capitalizing on all that exposure and all that progress. And I think it can get lost because the recruiting window doesn't end when the last out is made, right? It continues after the event. And I think a strong follow-up really is where momentum is built. Even if it's just a quick text or a 5-minute post-event chat, I think that can go a long way keeping your players accountable, and helping them continuously move the ball forward. Because like I said, without follow-up, you kind of lose that momentum and things don't really turn the right way. So moving to our last talking point for tonight, we have some general points on recruiting, and I will let Max take it away.
Yeah. So first and foremost, one of the things that we talk a lot about, and we do this on almost every webinar that we host for travel coaches or for players, most pointedly for players. One thing that's really important to remember is that ultimately the win in the recruiting process is that you're looking for overall and holistic fit. You're thinking about school and softball as a piece of that college experience rather than what's the biggest, baddest softball program that's going to commit me and I'll go there, whether it's in a city that's far away from home when I know I would do better in a city, on a campus that's not in a city and closer to home, right? How do all of the aspects of the school fit? Its geography, where it is in the country, where it is in relation to a city, what the climate is, do they have the right major, the academic focus for you? All of those pieces are going to impact the experience that your players have at college. And softball is certainly a very important piece of building that college experience, but it's important to think about this and to talk to players about this, I think, in terms of selecting for overall holistic fit. What is the best school fit for me, with softball considered as a factor, but not the only factor that I'm trying to optimize for in the college process?
Yeah, I mean, I think Max, what you're really speaking to is just research, right? Research schools thoroughly, right? Don't I think a lot of times players rely on a name or name recognition or what their teammates are doing, right? I think it's important for players to really dig into schools first and foremost, like you just said, academically, athletically, and socially. Like what kind of majors do they offer? What's the size of the school? What's their maybe playing style, roster size, coaching style? What is life like at that school with a particular major, right? I think that's also some valuable insight that players can get from having these asking these sort of questions and having these sort of conversations with coaches. Another thing is we talk about online resources. Use online campus tours to cast a wider net. I think we get it. It's not realistic to fly across the country to visit 10 different campuses, but make sure you're using the tools like virtual tours, student panels, coach Q&As. I think those are great starting points where players can get some sort of feel and some sort of insight into the schools that they're looking into. And like I said, if you're serious about casting a wide net, especially at high academic schools, you have to start digitally. You build your list broad and then you narrow it down from there, right? I think the goal is to really make sure that it's the right fit, like we were talking about, not just a big name or what essentially looks good on paper. Like if you really think about it, a target school list mainly just starts from the academics. But as you begin to ask and get the answers to these other questions that are super important, the list starts to become more refined. And with that, it's important that I think players, coaches, everybody keeps an open mind to this entire process, right? Some of the best fits that we've seen athletically and academically aren't going to be your dream school on day one of the recruiting process, right? So it's about staying open, right? Be willing to explore schools that you haven't heard of. I think this happens, Max, so many times at our events, right? Where players come in targeting one school or a handful of schools, maybe it's some flashy Ivies or NESCACs, and then find out over time that they fall in love with another school and a coach that they never knew of and they didn't even realize that they had their major, right? So go ahead. I think you can chime
Well,
in.
I think you nailed the two labels that I always bring up as examples because I think we see it the most often. I'm interested in Ivy League schools. Okay, that's fine. That's a worthwhile goal. There's some great schools. They are also wildly different from each other, right? If you're talking about Columbia, a school of 7 or 8,000 that's in the heart of Manhattan, and Dartmouth, a school of 5,000 that's in rural New Hampshire, and Cornell, which is a half public university that's 20,000 undergrads that's in upstate New York, there is almost nothing that those schools have in common other than that they play each other in softball, right? So if you're thinking about this from a school fit perspective, it probably doesn't make sense for players to say, I'm interested in Ivy League schools, right? Because they are so wildly different from each other. And the other is NESCAC, which I use in kind of a different way. We have a lot of players who say, I'm interested in NESCAC schools, which is great. Those often have a lot in common. Tufts, which is right down the road from me, is pretty different from Middlebury or Williams or Amherst or the rest of them. But, there's a little bit more in common. They tend to be liberal arts schools. They're a little bit smaller. They're all in New England. But if you say, I'm interested in NESCAC schools, then you can also expand your geographic footprint and say, oh, I'd never heard of Grinnell or Denison, but those are more or less NESCAC type schools
Mhm.
that they just airlifted out of New England and dropped in the Midwest. So if you're keeping an open mind and thinking from first principles and saying, okay, what are the qualities of the college experience that I'm looking for, then it's going to be able, and you do your research, as Mike said, then you're going to be able to not just narrow down your list, but narrow down your list to a point where you have a good set of schools, and then you can start to expand and look for lookalike schools that might not already be on your radar to create more opportunities for yourself as well.
Right. Yeah. No, very well said. That's awesome. Another thing that I always tell a lot of players, Max, I know you tell them as well, is to be patient. Your timing is not really equal to what a coach's timing is. I think this is a super hard one sometimes for players and parents to kind of understand and swallow. I think players and parents feel ready. You think that your stats, your videos, they speak for themselves, and in many cases certainly do. But recruiting doesn't always move at the pace that you want it to. I think everyone can agree with that for the most part. Especially in the higher academic space, because admission plays a role, and we see that it skews a little bit later into the late summer, into the fall, or even if a coach just isn't responding to you, which is going back to one of the first points you made earlier about staying persistent. Coaches are just sometimes waiting to finish up their season, right? It doesn't necessarily mean they're not interested. It just means like you have to stay ready and you have to trust the process, which is a perfect perfect segue into the last point, which is owning your own process, right? Student athletes need to make sure that they're the ones that are in the driver's seat, right? At the end of the day, this is a player's journey, right? Parents, coaches, mentors, like all us included, we're all here to support you. But like if you want to play college sports, then you need to lead the way. The players need to lead the way, right? And I think that's something that's really, really important. So looking at some of the don'ts, I think the biggest one at the top, which I think we teased before, is like that whole D1 or bust mentality. Um, you know, don't get your labels caught up or have that D1 or bust mindset. We say this all the time because I think it's important for players and parents to hear is that, in my opinion, the level doesn't really matter. The fit is what matters, right? Division one, two, three, none of them essentially guarantees a great experience. And I'm also a byproduct of this, having transferred schools. But that's why I also think that head first, like this is why we facilitate the player and coach connection, right? So that both sides can have as many touch points as possible with each other to see if it is the right fit, right? Chasing a logo or a label can take you to places where you may not actually thrive. Another huge thing that I also think is very sadly driven by social media nowadays is comparing your process to your teammates' process. we talked about this before, like everyone's timeline, everyone's plan is different. Every school list is different. Every recruiting story is different. You might have a teammate who commits as a sophomore and you're still figuring it out as a rising senior. That is totally okay. This isn't a race at all. It's about players that are focusing on their growth, your goals, and your plan, and it kind of lets their process be theirs, right? Comparison, in my opinion, leads to doubt. When if you stay focused, that is what really leads to results. And another touch point is don't be passive in this process. As you like to put it, Max, this isn't a time to be a couch potato. Like recruiting doesn't just come to you, right? You have to go get it, right? You can't sit back and just scroll through social media all day and hoping a coach magically emails you, right? You have to move. You have to take action. Going back to building that plan and actually owning this process. And I think Max, if you want to finish up on a couple more points here.
Yeah, so also we encourage players to not be in the majority who are only thinking about softball, right? And we see this more with the young men, the baseball players that we work with than the softball players, but it's really important to keep in mind this is an academic decision. You're making a decision about a holistic fit. It's 4 years that's going to set you up for the next 40 years beyond that, right? So you need to be thinking about this with softball as a piece of the puzzle, but not the entire picture. And so, there's plenty of players out there who are thinking, what's the school that's going to, give me the roster spot that's going to be in the College World Series? That's all well and good. But what are the other pieces of the puzzle? What are the other things that matter to your college experience? Also, don't fear rejection. Players are going to hear no in this process. They are going to hear a no from a coach. It might be the coach at their dream school. You cannot fear rejection because that's going to limit the chances that you're willing to take, and you're going to leave stuff on the table, right? So what I always say to players is every no hurts, but it's a gift, right? Because it at least helps you orient and find your next step down the path, right? Every conversation with a coach can end with a yes or it can end with a no. If it's a yes, great, fantastic. You get your happily ever after, and that's where you go play softball. That's fantastic. The no, it hurts. It's going to suck. It is not fun to get a no, but it still helps you advance towards the next step because you know a little bit more than you did before that coach told you no, right? So, and there are different no's to get. A no can be, hey, I really like you as a player, but I don't need a pitcher or a catcher this year, so we're not actually not recruiting your position. That's a different no. That means, okay, this school doesn't have space for me because they aren't looking for my exact positional needs. But what I gathered from that is that I could go play at schools that are at the same level of softball, the same level of academics, as opposed to you know what, right now you don't project at our level of college softball. That's a different no. It can still help you learn and say, okay, maybe I need to adjust my goals, adjust the schools in my target list. So every no is going to hurt, but it's also an opportunity for players to continue to refine their process and continue to take that next step down the path more informed than they were before that.
No,
Another,
go
yeah,
ahead. Sorry, Max. No, keep
no,
going.
no.
Keep going.
Don't assume that they will find you, right? That is, we talked about this a lot. You got to be proactive. You don't want to be found. You want to find yourself through the process. And then finally, don't have any regrets. Don't leave anything on the table. I think that for players, for teenagers especially, I think it's really easy, and this is everybody falls victim to this. It's really easy to leave yourself an out or leave yourself an excuse and say, well, yeah, I could have done that, but I didn't really try to do that, right? You don't want your players to be that kid in college. So don't let them leave anything on the table. Hold them accountable. Help them be accountable to themselves and to their process so that they don't have any regrets. They don't leave anything on the table. They're keeping an open mind. They're doing their research. They're putting themselves in a position to succeed because ultimately I can't guarantee any specific outcome, but I can guarantee you that if you go through this process in the right way, the outcome is going to be the best available outcome for your players if you go through it in this way that we're talking about.
That's awesome. And then Max, the point I was going to make before is like I loved how you were explaining how you have to refine your list, right? But it's always interesting to see when players do get a decent amount of interest from a couple schools, they have to remember like you can't play at all these schools at the same time. Like you're at some point you're going to have to make those tough decisions. Like yes, sometimes the easiest is when a coach tells you, like, and it's not great, like you said, it sucks, but hey, it's a no, great. I crossed that school off the list. The schools that say yes, I circle them and I go at those schools 110%. And then naturally, yes, as I research more, get a feel for those schools, then I can really start making the hard decisions where, like, okay, now I have to really, really narrow down. And that's how you come down to that funnel of like, this is the school that I'm meant to be at.
100%. I refer to it as, not to get too in the weeds, but I call it Schrodinger's recruit, right? Before you open the box, before you ask the coach the question, you don't know if your recruiting process in the box is alive or dead. And so you can't move forward. You're kind of paralyzed by not knowing what the best next step is. So eventually there comes a time when you do need to ask, you need to open the box. And if the answer is no, it is going to be painful, but it will help inform what you're able to do next coming out of that.
I think we need to trademark that. I think that's a that's a pretty good one. Thanks, Max. So that wraps up our main talking points for the night. For the next part, we'd like to shift into a Q&A. So if anybody in the live audience has any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A box at the top. We'll do our best to answer them and all that. But while we wait for that, we did go ahead and pre-prepare a few questions that we've gotten in the past. So I'll quickly kick it off. And the first one that I always hear, it's one question that always comes up. I think more and more, it's a very relevant topic, especially for players as they become more active in their recruiting process, is how does social media play a role in recruiting? I think we teased it a couple times, Max, in this webinar. And I think the short answer is it could be a huge asset, right? But it has to be used the right way. I think today, social media, Twitter X, I think acts as a one-stop shop for a lot of college coaches to get an initial read on a player, right? Think about it. If or when a coach opens your profile on your Twitter or an Instagram, they should immediately see your grad year, your position, GPA, test score, schedule, video highlights, all this sort of stuff. It should be pinned pretty much to the top. And it saves them a lot of time, right? Instead of digging through emails and downloading clips or waiting for responses back and forth, the follow-up message, they can kind of get a snapshot of who you are as a player in a couple seconds, right? So that's why I always encourage players who have a recruiting profile to include those as links or attachments at the bottom in emails that they send to coaches. If players don't have one, I don't think it can hurt them. I just think it's another asset they can add. It's not a mandatory, but it certainly is something that can assist them. And honestly, I think for coaches, it just makes their job a little easier. It shows that you're kind of organized. Like I said, it gives them access to everything all in one place without that back and forth. An important tip is, as we could all imagine, like keeping that social media profile clean and professional, right? You should I always say, like, make it act like your digital business card, right? Include the key information, the videos, keep everything appropriate and focused. But ultimately, I think social media, it's not going to necessarily get you recruited, but I think it can open the door and keep a coach's attention if it's done right. Going full circle, how can a player who's maybe a 2027 or even a 2026 get on a coach's radar? I think this is one of those tactics that makes it easy for them to learn who you are and give them a reason to kind of keep digging deeper.
Yeah, I think that a few key points to keep in mind for social that I would call out is not only keep it clean, but have a dedicated profile. Your players have a dedicated profile just for softball so that it's not hard for coaches to find their latest video or their latest stat line or whatever it is, right? Have one that's dedicated for softball so that it's really easy for coaches to use to get a quick view of a player. And then also in the bio, include all the things you need to include an email address, your grad year, position, include your GPA, include a link to your sports recruits profile, whatever it is. Have all that in the bio so that coaches can get all the information, or at least most of the information that they need as quickly as possible instead of having to hunt it down across a couple different platforms.
Awesome. Max, we did get a question from our main man, Manny, who is here in attendance with us. So his question, if you want to take a stab at it, is what are the dates for D2, D3, and NAIA when it comes to talking to players?
Yeah, so we talked about D1, right? D1 they can talk to players September 1st of their junior year. So on this coming September 1st, D1 coaches will be able to talk to the class of 2027s and have quote unquote recruiting specific conversations. This means that they can make offers. It means that they can talk turkey about scholarships and roster spots and all that sort of stuff. That date is different by division. For D2, that date is June 15th after sophomore year. So it's a little bit earlier. It's basically a month and a half earlier for D2. NAIA and D3 aren't bound by those rules. There's no specific date, so they can talk to players about anything at any time. One important thing to keep in mind, though, is this doesn't mean that D1 schools or D2 schools at a Head First event can't talk to the class of 2027 until those dates. They can. They can still talk to 27s, 28s. Harvard's going to be at camp in early June. They can still talk to 2027 and 2028 high school grads. They just can't have those recruiting specific conversations. So Coach Rohn from Harvard can't walk up to you and say, hey, I really liked how you played. Send me your transcript and I'm going to walk it over to admissions, right? That's a recruiting specific conversation. But they can still get to know them, meet them face to face, shake their hand, get a sense of who they are as a player, offer them feedback, and have really productive relationship building conversations. On the D3 side, most of the schools that attend our events, just because it's where the preponderance of high academic schools are D1 and D3. So those are the ones that we kind of work most closely with. For D3, there aren't technically any dates around when they can talk to a player. They could walk up to an eighth grader and talk about whatever they want with that eighth grader. However, for the schools that we work with, that is not always the most productive use of their time because of the academic standards that these coaches are working with. So if you're, Coach Ferguson at Pomona Pitzer, you're mostly going to be talking to this summer 2026s and some 2027s because they're going to have the academic profile that is going to make sure that you're not, if you're that coach, kind of, wasting your time or barking up the wrong tree, that this kid that I'm talking to is roughly an academic fit and could be admissible to my program. So while there aren't the same rules guiding the D3, it kind of has this natural regulator on the high academic schools because they just need to know more academic info before they're able to really aggressively pursue recruits.
Awesome. Max, I think there's no more questions, but if we want, we can end with one more. I think it's pretty relevant. And I know we've gotten this question a lot from parents and players. And that last one is how can you tell if an invite to a prospect camp means a coach is seriously interested in recruiting in you? I would love to hear your take on that. And then I also have one as well, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, 100%. So this is another one that is kind of complicated at the D1 level by that September 1st date, right? Because up until then, basically all D1 coaches can send you is boilerplate language and a camp invite. So it's really tough to assess from that. Is this genuine interest? Is this coach really interested in me? Or is this just an email that they sent out to their whole recruiting database? What I always say is anything that is personalized is a pretty good sign that the coach is interested in you, right? If they send out a mass email and says, hey, here are our dates, but then they also send you an email saying, hey, Max, I just sent you an email that has some of our dates or for our prospect camp. I'd love to get you on campus. I know you've talked with the X, Y, or Z coach. Would love to have you meet some of the players in the team. That's a really good sign, right? So any kind of personal conversation or personal correspondence that you have with coaches is a great way to tell that interest is genuine. To kind of prompt some of that, sometimes what I think you could do is if you're in the place in the timeline where you're able to, is send a follow-up email and say, hey coach, I'm really interested in attending this prospect camp. I don't know if it's going to work out with my schedule, but I'm going to take a look and see what we can do. Send a reply email and see if that kind of gets some of this correspondence coming back your way. That can be a good way as well. So those are kind of the tips and tricks. Otherwise, you don't want to necessarily just be reading the tea leaves and trying to guess, but a lot of it is going to come from the college coach is the best source of truth on, are they really interested in me, obviously. And then I think one resource that travel coaches can be for players is, when I was in high school, if I had gotten an invite to LSU's prospect camp, I would have been over the moon. And if I had taken that to my travel coach or high school coach, they would have said, that's great, Max. that's not for you. Like they invited you, but you're not an LSU type kid, right? So I think that that's another resource that, or another area in which travel coaches can be a resource is be kind of a vetting process. Like, hey, it's great that you got this invite from Oklahoma. Right now, it feels like where you are as a player, that's probably more of a mass invite as opposed to,
Mhm.
genuine personal interest.
No, I love that. That was all me. I think context matters, right? I think the best case scenario is when you've already had a meaningful interaction with a coach and that there's a relationship built beforehand. I think that's why events like ours, like Head First, are so valuable, right? You're not just sending a video and hoping for a response. You're getting face to face time with those coaches. You're having real conversations, and you're learning things like who are they recruiting, what are they actively looking for your position, like we talked about, and that insight is gold, right? Especially for rising seniors, but also rising juniors. It helps figure out whether attending a school's prospect camp is a smart investment for your time, your money, and energy, or if it's just a shot in the dark, right? If you've had an interaction with the coach, they've seen you play, they've given you feedback and expressed interest, like that prospect camp, theoretically, you can kind of conclude means something, right? But if this is like your first touch point, this is your first point of contact, it's harder to tell. So I always say like focus on building relationships and gaining insight, and then you can kind of make smarter decisions about where to show up. All right, well, that concludes our webinar for tonight. Max, thank you very much. If anybody is interested in reaching out to us, our emails are listed here. They've been listed for a little bit. If you want to check out our website, that's there as well, as long as our socials. But I appreciate everybody joining us for tonight. Really, really enjoyed it. Hope there was some valuable stuff. Like we said, if anybody would like this in the form of a recording, we're happy to send that out. But everybody, thank you, take care, and good night.
Thank you all for joining us. Thanks.